The sun bathed the Bridgerton estate in a golden light as the sounds of morning echoed through the grand halls. Footsteps hurried up and down the staircases, and servants moved swiftly to prepare the household for the day that would mark Daphne Bridgerton's official debut into society. The air was thick with anticipation. Daphne stood before the full-length mirror in her chambers, taking in the sight of herself dressed in the finest white satin gown, its delicate lace trim brushing against her skin. Her heart fluttered with nerves, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she reached up to adjust a loose curl of her chestnut hair. Behind her, the sound of the door creaking open brought her out of her thoughts. Perfect as always, came the familiar voice of her mother, Lady Violet Bridgerton. With graceful poise, she entered the room, her gaze falling on her eldest daughter. "This is your moment, Daphne. The beginning of everything." Daphne offered a nervous smile, unsure if it was entirely true. While many young ladies dreamed of the day they would enter the marriage market, it felt more like an impending storm to her, a whirlwind of judgment, expectations, and the uncertainty of finding a match that could change her life forever. "I hope so," Daphne replied, smoothing the bodice of her gown. "But what if it isn't? What if I fail to make an impression?" Lady Bridgerton's expression softened, and she stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Daphne's shoulder. "You are a Bridgerton, and one of the finest ladies in London. There's no doubt you'll find a suitable match. You've been raised for this moment." Yet despite her mother's reassurances, Daphne felt the weight of the evening looming over her like a heavy curtain. Her debut into Regency London society meant more than just finding a husband. It was about securing a future, building alliances, and upholding the reputation of the Bridgerton family. She had always known this, but now that the moment had arrived, it felt suffocating that a knock at the door broke the tension, and Daphne's younger sister Eloise, bright-eyed and sharp-tongued, burst into the room with her usual energy. "Honestly, Daphne, you look like you're about to march off to war." "It's just a ball." Daphne let out a small laugh, appreciating Eloise's ability to cut through the tension. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one facing the battlefield of suitors." Eloise wrinkled her nose in mock disgust. "Thank goodness for that. I can think of nothing more tedious. And besides, I doubt there's anyone out there who could even hold a candle to you. They'll all be tripping over themselves the moment you step into the ballroom." Daphne shook her head at her sister's dramatics, but the light-hearted teasing did little to calm her nerves. The truth was, the pressure to find a perfect match hung over her head like a dark cloud. She had witnessed what it had been like for other young women whose debuts didn't go as planned. Reputations could be tarnished in an instant, and once the gossip-mongers got hold of a scandal, it could be difficult, if not impossible, to recover. With one last glance in the mirror, Daphne squared her shoulders. Tonight, she would have to be flawless. She had no other choice. The Bridgerton carriage rattled through the bustling streets of London, and Daphne felt her stomach twist with each bump. The grand buildings and manicured gardens of the ton's most exclusive residences passed in a blur, though the young debutante scarcely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by the evening ahead. Tonight, she would make her debut at Lady Danbury's ball, and the most eligible bachelors of the season would be present, evaluating her with every turn of her head, every graceful step she took. Her brother, Anthony, sat opposite her in the carriage, his expression unreadable. As the eldest Bridgerton son and head of the family, Anthony had taken his role of protector to heart. His approval, or disapproval, would weigh heavily on the success of her debut. "You don't have to look so serious," Anthony said, noticing her tension. "There's no need to worry. I'll make sure no unsuitable scoundrels come anywhere near you." Daphne suppressed a groan. "Anthony, I appreciate your concern, but you mustn't scare away every man who approaches me." "I'm not scaring them away," Anthony replied with a smirk. "I'm simply ensuring that no one unworthy of you tries to court you." "That's not exactly comforting," Daphne muttered, staring out the window. The truth was, while she appreciated Anthony's protectiveness, she feared it would make her debut even more difficult. How was she to secure a suitable match if her brother sent every suitor fleeing before they had a chance to speak? As the carriage slowed to a stop outside Lady Danbury's grand townhouse, Daphne felt a fresh wave of nerves. The sound of the footman's footsteps and the clatter of the carriage door being opened snapped her back to reality. She took a deep breath, the sweet scent of summer roses filling the air as she stepped out onto the cobblestone street. The ballroom was a glittering sea of gowns and jewels, chandeliers casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed crowd. The hum of conversation filled the air, but Daphne felt every eye on her as she entered on Anthony's arm. Her family's reputation preceded her, and there was no denying that expectations for her were higher than most. As Lady Danbury announced her entrance, the room seemed to pause for a moment. Daphne's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the crowd. This was it. Her debut had officially begun, and with it, the race to secure her future. The following morning, the crisp sound of paper being unfolded echoed through the Bridgerton breakfast room as Benedict, Daphne's second eldest brother, sat at the table, eyes scanning the fresh edition of the infamous Lady Whistledown society papers. The rest of the family, already gathered for breakfast, exchanged knowing glances. The arrival of a new column from Lady Whistledown was always cause for gossip and speculation. "Ah, here it is," Benedict said with a smirk, holding the paper up triumphantly. "Lady Whistledown's latest. Let's see who has caught her eye this time." Daphne, seated beside her mother, felt her stomach tighten in anticipation. She knew she had drawn attention at the ball last night, everyone had seemed to watch her every move, but being mentioned in Lady Whistledown's column was another matter entirely. The mysterious author's words could make or break a debutante's reputation in a matter of moments. "Read it aloud, Benedict," Eloise urged, her usual curiosity shining through. "Let's hear who's about to be the talk of the ton." Benedict cleared his throat dramatically and began to read. "The season has officially begun, and with it, the arrival of many a fine young debutante seeking a suitable match. Among them, none have caught my eye quite so splendidly as Miss Daphne Bridgerton, eldest daughter of the esteemed Bridgerton family. With her charm, beauty, and an undeniable grace, Miss Bridgerton certainly stands to become the jewel of this season's marriage market. Yet, one must wonder, will she live up to the high expectations placed upon her? Or will the overbearing presence of her protective brother scare away any potential suitors before they even have a chance to woo her? Benedict paused, raising an eyebrow at Anthony, who sat at the head of the table with a stoic expression. "Well, well, brother. It appears you've already made an impression on Lady Whistledown herself," Benedict teased. Anthony merely rolled his eyes. "Whistledown seems to have far too much time on her hands if she's paying attention to me." Daphne, however, was less amused. The mention of her name in Lady Whistledown's column sent a wave of unease through her. The compliment about her grace and beauty was flattering, but the veiled criticism of Anthony's interference was not lost on her. If Lady Whistledown had noticed, then the rest of society surely had as well. "She's right, you know," Eloise chimed in with her usual bluntness. "You were hovering around Daphne all night, scaring away half the men in the room." Anthony shot his younger sister a warning glance, but Daphne couldn't help but agree. She had sensed it, too. Anthony's presence had been more of a shield than a support. The eligible bachelors who had dared to approach her had done so cautiously, their eyes flicking nervously toward her brother before retreating back into the crowd. "Don't let Lady Whistledown bother you," Lady Violet interjected, sensing Daphne's growing unease. "The opinions of a gossip columnist are hardly something to worry about." But Daphne knew better. In Regency society, appearances were everything, and Lady Whistledown's words carried an almost prophetic weight. If the column hinted that she might struggle to find a suitor due to Anthony's overprotectiveness, then potential matches might start avoiding her for fear of getting involved in family drama. She pushed her plate away, her appetite suddenly gone. Later that afternoon, as Daphne walked through the bustling streets of London with her mother and sisters, whispers of Lady Whistledown's latest column seemed to follow them like a shadow. Every group of finely dressed ladies and gentlemen they passed exchanged hushed words, punctuated by curious glances in Daphne's direction. "Did you hear?" one woman murmured to her companion, loud enough for Daphne to overhear. Lady Whistledown praised her, but there's talk that her brother might be too overbearing. It could ruin her chances. Daphne felt the heat rise in her cheeks but kept her head held high. She had been raised to navigate these waters, to smile and remain poised no matter what. Still, the whispers were unnerving. It seemed that everyone was waiting to see whether she would live up to the expectations placed on her, or whether her debut would be overshadowed by her family's interference. As they turned the corner onto Bond Street, they spotted Lady Danbury, her sharp eyes gleaming as she approached. The older woman was a force to be reckoned with in society, known for her wit and wisdom, as well as her refusal to bow to anyone's expectations. She smiled as she neared the Bridgerton ladies. "Ah, Daphne, my dear," Lady Danbury said, her tone warm but her gaze calculating. "I trust you've recovered from last night's festivities." "Of course, Lady Danbury," Daphne replied politely. "It was a wonderful evening." "Indeed," Lady Danbury said, her cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. "Though I must say, you'll need to find a way to loosen that brother of yours. Lady Whistledown has quite the sharp tongue, and it seems she's taken notice of his overzealousness." Daphne forced a smile, though her heart sank. Even Lady Danbury had noticed. "Anthony means well," Daphne replied, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself anymore. "He just wants to ensure I find the right match." Of course he does, Lady Danbury said with a knowing look. But in this world, my dear, appearances are everything. You would do well to ensure that your brother's protection doesn't come at the cost of your freedom. With that, Lady Danbury bid them farewell, leaving Daphne with much to think about. As the afternoon wore on, the weight of Lady Whistledown's words hung heavily over Daphne. She could feel the scrutiny everywhere she went, the eyes of society watching her, judging her every move, every step, every word. For all her preparation, for all her beauty and charm, none of it would matter if the Tun decided that she was more trouble than she was worth. Back at the Bridgerton estate, Daphne found herself sitting alone in the drawing room, staring at the very copy of Lady Whistledown's society papers that had set the day's events into motion. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, her mind racing with possibilities. How could she prove that she was more than just a sister under Anthony's watchful eye? How could she ensure that she remained desirable to the suitors she had yet to meet? One thing was certain, Lady Whistledown was watching her, and society would be, too. Every move she made from here on would be scrutinized, analyzed, and commented upon. But Daphne was determined not to let gossip decide her fate. She would find her own way through the tangled web of Regency society, and with or without her brother's interference, she would ensure her debut was a success. As the sun began to set outside the window, Daphne made a quiet vow to herself: she would not let the words of Lady Whistledown define her. She would chart her own path. The lavish ballroom of Lady Danbury's estate glittered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, setting the perfect stage for the social event that marked the official opening of the season. The air hummed with excitement as London's finest gathered, dressed in their most elegant gowns and sharpest evening wear. Whispers of gossip and curiosity filled the space, eyes discreetly watching as the crème de la crème of Regency society made their entrances. Among them, none drew as many eyes as Daphne Bridgerton, the dazzling debutante of the night. Her gown, a soft ivory with delicate lace trim, hugged her figure in the most modest and refined way, enhancing her natural beauty without the need for unnecessary adornment. Her dark hair was swept into an intricate updo, and her face glowed with youthful elegance. As she stepped into the ballroom, accompanied by her family, there was a noticeable pause, a collective intake of breath as the crowd registered her arrival. Daphne could feel the weight of the attention on her shoulders. She was the eldest Bridgerton daughter, expected to make a stellar match. Her future, and by extension the reputation of her family, rested on how she presented herself tonight. Despite her nerves, she had been raised for this moment, and she knew exactly how to hold herself, graceful and poised, every smile calculated, every movement fluid. Anthony, her eldest brother, stood beside her, his eyes scanning the room with an air of protectiveness that bordered on overbearing. While Daphne appreciated his concern, she couldn't help but feel slightly stifled by it. Tonight was supposed to be her moment, but it was clear that Anthony intended to watch her every move. As the Bridgerton family made their rounds, exchanging pleasantries with friends and acquaintances, Daphne caught snippets of conversations swirling around her. "Is that Miss Bridgerton? She looks radiant. Such poise. She'll surely have her pick of suitors. I hear her brother is terribly protective, he's likely to scare off anyone who dares approach." When the first strains of the evening's waltz began, Daphne felt her nerves rise as eligible gentlemen started seeking out partners. She waited, her breath catching slightly, as her gaze swept the room, searching for someone who would ask her for the first dance. Soon enough, a tall, fair-haired gentleman approached. Lord Hemsworth, a viscount from a prominent family, bowed politely before her. "Miss Bridgerton, may I have the honor of this dance?" Daphne felt a wave of relief. Lord Hemsworth was a respectable choice, handsome, well-mannered, and entirely acceptable. She glanced at Anthony, seeking his approval, but before she could speak, her brother stepped forward, his expression a mixture of authority and thinly veiled annoyance. "Miss Bridgerton is engaged for this dance," Anthony said curtly, not even sparing Lord Hemsworth a glance. The young Viscount looked taken aback, but he quickly nodded and retreated, clearly unwilling to challenge Anthony's word. Daphne, however, was less inclined to let it pass. "Anthony," she hissed under her breath, keeping her voice low so as not to draw attention. "I wasn't engaged for that dance. I'm simply ensuring that your suitors are of the highest quality," he replied, his tone firm. Daphne sighed, forcing herself to keep her frustration in check. "Lord Hemsworth is perfectly respectable. He's also on the verge of financial ruin," Anthony replied dismissively. "I won't have you wasting your time on a man with nothing to offer." She clenched her jaw, biting back a retort. This was supposed to be her night, but it seemed Anthony was determined to dictate the terms. As the evening progressed, more potential suitors came and went, all turned away by Anthony before they could even exchange pleasantries with Daphne. Men of good standing, charm, and wealth, none seemed to meet his impossible standards. She felt trapped. The carefully crafted persona she had spent years building, the debutante who could win over the ton, was being overshadowed by her brother's domineering presence. Each time she caught someone's eye, Anthony stepped in, his looming figure a silent but clear deterrent. Across the ballroom, Lady Danbury, ever perceptive, watched with a raised brow. She had seen this dynamic play out countless times before, a protective brother scaring away every potential suitor in a misguided attempt to shield his sister from the world. But the season did not wait for overprotective siblings. If Anthony didn't loosen his grip, Daphne's prospects could suffer. As Daphne stood to the side, trying to remain composed, Lady Whistledown's words from her latest column echoed in her mind. "Will Miss Bridgerton's beauty be enough to overcome the shadow of her brother's overzealous protection?" It seemed the Ton was already noticing what Daphne herself was struggling to ignore. The evening was nearly halfway through when Lord Finchley, a young baron with a reputation for being charming and kind-hearted, approached. This time, he bypassed Anthony, bowing directly before Daphne. "Miss Bridgerton, may I have the honor?" Before Anthony could step in, Daphne quickly accepted. "I would be delighted, Lord Finchley." Anthony's eyes narrowed, but to her relief, he stepped back, perhaps realizing that any further interference would cause a scene. As Lord Finchley led her to the dance floor, Daphne felt a sense of victory, albeit a small one. The ballroom's candlelight reflected off the polished marble floors, and the soft strains of the orchestra filled the space as they began to waltz. For a moment, Daphne allowed herself to enjoy the evening, her earlier frustration melting away, but she couldn't escape the feeling that everyone in the room was watching, judging. And, of course, Lady Whistledown was likely taking notes, ready to pen her next column filled with sharp observations about the Bridgertons. As the dance continued, Daphne forced herself to smile and engage in light conversation, though her mind was elsewhere. She knew that she needed to find a balance, she needed to shine on her own, without Anthony's constant interference, or risk her prospects being dimmed before they'd even begun. As the evening wound down, Daphne returned to her family's side, a polite smile still on her face despite her growing exhaustion. Anthony, ever vigilant, stood by her side, scanning the room once more as if daring anyone to come near. It was then that Daphne realized that if she was to succeed this season, she would have to find a way to step out from under Anthony's shadow. She could not let his overprotectiveness define her chances. She would need to forge her own path, no matter the cost. And as the night drew to a close, she couldn't help but wonder what Lady Whistledown would write about tonight's events, and how much of her future would be shaped by the sharp pen of a mysterious gossipmonger. As the guests left and the ballroom emptied, Daphne was left with a single thought: this was just the beginning. The morning after the ball, the Bridgerton household was abuzz with the aftermath of the evening's events. Letters and calling cards arrived at a rapid pace, but Daphne's mood was far from celebratory. Despite her radiant appearance and graceful demeanor at the ball, the night had not gone as she had hoped. Her brother's presence, like an ever-watchful shadow, had turned away nearly every suitor before they could even properly engage her in conversation. Sitting at the breakfast table, Daphne stared at the neat piles of invitations her mother had arranged for her review. Violet Bridgerton, always composed, gave her daughter an encouraging smile as she sorted through the messages. "Look at all of these, Daphne. You were the talk of the ball," Violet said, her tone light but firm. "Everyone is eager to see you again." Daphne offered a polite smile in return, but the truth weighed heavily on her. Yes, people were talking about her, but how much of that attention was positive? The Lady Whistledown column from the night before had already made its rounds, and the sharp, critical words lingered in Daphne's mind. Miss Bridgerton, though possessed of considerable charm and beauty, may find her prospects dimming under the ever-watchful eye of her brother, Viscount Bridgerton, whose well-meaning protection serves as more of a barrier than a blessing. Will any gentleman dare to pass the gauntlet that is Lord Bridgerton's approval? Daphne sighed softly as she stirred her tea, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. While society had noticed her, they were also keenly aware of Anthony's overbearing presence. She had become a symbol of unattainable perfection, encased in a glass box by her brother's scrutiny. Suitors seemed more wary of Anthony than they were enchanted by her. Later that day, Daphne accompanied her mother and siblings on their morning promenade through Hyde Park, an activity designed not only for fresh air but for seeing and being seen. High society often paraded through the park, displaying their finest clothes and making subtle moves in the ongoing game of appearances and reputation. As they strolled, Daphne noticed groups of young men lingering near the edges of their path. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense the curiosity and interest, but none approached. Anthony, walking with the authority of a general leading troops into battle, cast a long shadow over her prospects. Eloise, Daphne's younger sister, who had little patience for the marriage market and its endless games, finally broke the silence. "It's absurd, you know," she said bluntly, her voice cutting through the awkward tension. The way all these men act as though they're terrified of you." Daphne glanced at her younger sister with an exasperated smile. "They're not terrified of me, Eloise. They're terrified of Anthony." "Well, I suppose that's true," Eloise continued, unbothered. "He does look ready to challenge anyone who so much as glances in your direction." "Eloise," Violet said gently, her tone a mixture of admonishment and amusement, "you should not speak so freely." "But she's right," Daphne interjected, frustration creeping into her voice. "How am I supposed to make a match if no one dares come near me? Anthony is driving away every potential suitor before I've even had the chance to speak with them." Violet regarded her eldest daughter with a mixture of sympathy and practicality. "Your brother is only trying to protect you. He has always taken his role as head of the family seriously. But perhaps I could speak to him about giving you more freedom during these outings." Daphne sighed, not entirely convinced that a simple conversation would change Anthony's deeply ingrained behavior. "I don't need protection. I need the chance to make my own decisions, to show the world that I'm capable of managing myself." Violet placed a gentle hand on Daphne's arm. "I know, my dear. But remember, appearances are everything in our world. It is a game, one of reputation and control. You must learn to navigate it carefully, even when it seems unfair." That afternoon, Lady Danbury hosted a small gathering for the young debutantes and their suitors. The event was far less grand than the ball, more intimate and informal, offering an opportunity for introductions and conversation without the overwhelming pressure of a ballroom. It was precisely the kind of setting where Daphne hoped to make more genuine connections. As they entered Lady Danbury's lavish drawing room, Daphne felt a flicker of hope. Anthony had been invited but had decided to remain behind, leaving her free to navigate this social terrain without his looming presence. She moved through the crowd with grace, exchanging pleasantries with the other young women and listening politely as various gentlemen made small talk. Lord Ambrose, a tall and slender man of about 30, approached her with a charming smile. His reputation as a respectable landowner preceded him, and Daphne felt relieved that at last, someone seemed willing to engage with her on his own terms. "Miss Bridgerton," Lord Ambrose began, bowing slightly. "It is a pleasure to see you again after last night's ball. I trust you found the evening enjoyable." Daphne returned his smile, eager to cultivate the conversation. "It was quite the event, though a bit overwhelming with all the attention. But I suppose that is the nature of the season." Lord Ambrose chuckled softly. "Indeed, the season can be a challenge. But I must say, you handled yourself with remarkable grace, especially considering the high expectations placed upon you." Before Daphne could reply, she noticed a few other gentlemen lingering nearby, clearly interested in joining the conversation but hesitant to interrupt. She felt a sense of satisfaction that, without Anthony's interference, they were finally approaching her. But just as Lord Ambrose prepared to ask her for a dance, a voice from behind cut through the moment, "Miss Bridgerton." Daphne turned to see Lord Berbrook, the same suitor Anthony had dismissed the night before, standing before her with a self-satisfied grin. He bowed deeply, clearly determined to make an impression. "Lord Berbrook," Daphne said, her smile forced as she noticed the other gentleman slipping away from the scene, clearly unwilling to compete for her attention. "I was hoping we could resume our conversation from last night," Berbrook said, oblivious to the tension in Daphne's polite response. "I feel we were unfairly interrupted." Daphne's heart sank. Once again, the rules of appearances and reputation were working against her. Lord Berbrook's persistence, while technically appropriate by society standards, was not welcome, but turning him away publicly could have consequences for her standing. And with no other suitors nearby to challenge him, she was left with no choice but to endure the conversation. As the evening drew to a close, Daphne found herself growing more and more frustrated. Every time she attempted to assert her own agency, the rules of high society, or her brother's overbearing presence, seemed to stifle her. The suitors who might have been genuinely interested were intimidated by the game that was being played around her, a game of reputation, protection, and appearances that she had little control over, and, of course, Lady Whistledown would be watching. As Daphne sat in Lady Danbury's drawing room, feigning polite interest in Lord Berbrook's tedious conversation, she resolved that something had to change. She could not spend the entire season fighting against her brother's interference and the unspoken rules of society. She had to find a way to reclaim control of her own future, even if it meant defying expectations. The game of appearances may have been the only one society knew how to play, but Daphne Bridgerton was determined to make her own rules. The news of the Duke of Hastings' arrival in town spread through London's high society like wildfire. Simon Basset, one of the most eligible bachelors in all of England, had been absent from the marriage market for years, choosing instead to travel the world and avoid the very pressures that now surrounded Daphne. His return stirred excitement, especially among the mothers of debutantes, who saw him as the perfect match for their daughters. Daphne, however, Simon's arrival was little more than another ripple in the chaotic waters of her season. She had heard the stories, of course, the whispers about his rebellious nature, his staunch refusal to marry, and his infamous charm. Yet, she hadn't given much thought to him until that afternoon at Lady Danbury's garden party, when fate, or perhaps chance, brought them face to face. The party was being held in Lady Danbury's sprawling gardens, an opulent event meant to showcase the beauty of the season and allow the eligible young ladies to mingle with potential suitors. Daphne arrived with her mother, dressed in a pale blue gown that shimmered under the late afternoon sun, her expression a mix of determination and weariness after the last few days. As she made her way through the clusters of well-dressed guests, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her more than ever. Despite her charm, her beauty, and her poise, the suitors still seemed cautious, wary of crossing Anthony's ever-watchful eye. She was just about to step forward to greet a young lord when the crowd around her began to shift, whispers and murmurs rippling through the air like a wave. Heads turned, conversations paused, and a sense of anticipation filled the space. Daphne followed their gazes and saw him, Simon Basset, the Duke of Hastings. He cut an imposing figure as he entered the gardens, tall, with sharp features and a confident stride that drew the eyes of every woman present. His dark, intense gaze scanned the crowd with the detachment of a man who was fully aware of his effect on those around him, yet entirely uninterested in the attention. His tailored coat and breeches fit him perfectly, and his air of indifference only added to his allure. Daphne's first impression of him was one of coldness. Despite his undeniable good looks, there was a sharpness in his gaze that made it clear he was not someone easily swayed by the frivolities of society. Unlike the other men in the ton, who eagerly sought the approval of London's elite, the Duke of Hastings seemed to be above it all, as though he were merely tolerating the event rather than participating in it. Daphne stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Lady Danbury made her way to Simon, welcoming him with the familiarity of an old friend. As the two exchanged pleasantries, Daphne realized that her position made her one of the few debutantes not fawning over the Duke's arrival. In fact, she had no interest in him at all. She turned to rejoin her group, hoping to slip away unnoticed, but just as she took a step, Lady Danbury called out to her. "Miss Bridgerton. Come, come, I have someone you must meet." Daphne inwardly cringed, knowing what was coming. She turned, smiled politely, and walked toward Lady Danbury and the Duke. Simon glanced in her direction, his expression unreadable as his eyes swept over her with casual curiosity. "Your Grace," Lady Danbury said, her voice dripping with mischief, "may I present Miss Daphne Bridgerton? I'm sure you've heard of her, she's been the talk of the ton." Daphne curtsied gracefully, though she could feel the weight of Simon's disinterested gaze on her. "Your Grace," she greeted him with practiced politeness. Simon gave a shallow bow, his eyes meeting hers with a cool indifference that was both unnerving and frustrating. "Miss Bridgerton." There was a pause, the kind that felt like an eternity in such settings. Daphne expected him to say something, to at least offer some pleasantry or small talk, but he remained silent, his eyes flickering around the room as though he were already bored of the conversation. Feeling the tension build, Daphne decided to break the silence. "It is quite an honor to meet you, Your Grace," she said, though the words felt hollow. "I understand you've only just returned to town. How are you finding London after your travels?" Simon's lips curled slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "As dull as ever, I'm afraid." His bluntness took Daphne by surprise, and she blinked, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to such directness, especially from someone of his rank. Most gentlemen would have engaged in meaningless small talk, but Simon Basset, it seemed, had no time for such frivolities. "I see," Daphne replied, her tone cool but polite. "Perhaps you haven't yet seen all that London has to offer." Simon's gaze returned to hers, and for the first time, there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Perhaps not," he said, his voice low and smooth. "But I suspect it will be much the same as before. The same people, the same conversations, the same expectations." Daphne's brow furrowed slightly. His words echoed her own frustrations with the rigid world of the ton, but there was something about his tone that irritated her. It was as though he saw the world she inhabited as something beneath him, something unworthy of his time. "Well," she said, her voice tinged with a hint of challenge, "I suppose that depends on what you're looking for, Your Grace. London can be full of surprises if you know where to look." Simon's eyes met hers again, this time with a sharper intensity. "I've found that most surprises in London are rarely worth the trouble." The tension between them was palpable now, a subtle clash of wills hidden beneath the veneer of politeness. Daphne was not accustomed to being dismissed so easily, and she could feel her frustration rising. But she also knew that showing any sign of annoyance would only prove his point, that the women of the ton were predictable and easily flustered. So instead, she smiled, sweetly, but with an edge. "Perhaps you haven't met the right people, Your Grace." Lady Danbury, who had been watching the exchange with a raised brow, let out a delighted laugh. "Oh, I do believe you've met your match, Simon." Simon glanced at the older woman, his expression unreadable. "I'm not in search of a match," he said flatly, his gaze briefly flickering back to Daphne. "Nor am I," Daphne replied smoothly, her eyes meeting his with unwavering confidence. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Simon looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. There was something in her tone that caught his attention, a quiet strength that set her apart from the other debutantes he had met over the years. But whatever curiosity he might have felt, he quickly buried it beneath his usual mask of indifference. "Well then," Simon said, his voice cool and detached, "it seems we are in agreement." Daphne nodded once, her smile never faltering. "Indeed." With that, Simon gave another shallow bow and excused himself, leaving Daphne standing with Lady Danbury, who was now watching her with an amused gleam in her eye. "Well, my dear," Lady Danbury said, "I do believe you've managed to pique the Duke's interest, whether he admits it or not." Daphne shook her head, still irritated by the encounter. "He's insufferable," she muttered. Lady Danbury chuckled. "Oh, he most certainly is. But he's also one of the most sought-after men in England, and from what I've seen, you're one of the few women who's not falling at his feet. That alone is enough to catch his attention." Daphne sighed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She had no interest in winning the Duke's favor, but something about their encounter had sparked a fire within her. She had met men like him before, arrogant, dismissive, convinced that they were above the rest of society. But Simon Basset was different. He didn't just see the world as beneath him, he seemed to resent it altogether, and while she didn't care to admit it, Daphne found herself intrigued by him. Not because of his title or his reputation, but because, for the first time, she felt as though she had met someone who saw the world as imperfect as she did, but that didn't change the fact that he was still insufferable. As the garden party continued around her, Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just become a great deal more complicated. And though she wouldn't have admitted it to anyone, least of all herself, she suspected that the Duke of Hastings would play a much larger role in her season than she had originally planned. The game had only just begun. The pressure of the marriage market had become unbearable for both Daphne and Simon. Every ball, every social gathering was a battlefield where they were forced to navigate the endless advances of well-meaning, but ultimately bothersome, suitors and matchmakers. For Daphne, the prospects of a true love match seemed to grow dimmer by the day, her brother Anthony's overbearing presence driving away any real contenders. As for Simon, he was determined to remain a bachelor, uninterested in the false pretenses and manipulative charm of society's scheming mothers. It was during one particularly exhausting ball at the Featheringtons' residence, amid the stifling heat and ceaseless chatter, that Daphne and Simon found themselves in an unexpected alliance. Daphne stood near the edge of the ballroom, her fan moving lazily in front of her face as she tried to avoid the sharp stares of yet another eager suitor's mother. She was tired, not just physically, but emotionally. Her reputation had become a game piece in the ton's gossip, and with every passing day, it seemed that her chances of securing a meaningful match were dwindling. Across the room, Simon watched the proceedings with his usual detached air. He had lost count of how many eager mothers and daughters had approached him throughout the night, their thinly veiled attempts at charm doing nothing to sway him. He had no intention of marrying, and yet, society refused to accept this simple truth that it was in that moment, when Daphne caught Simon's gaze across the crowded room, that an idea began to take root in her mind. With a determined expression, Daphne excused herself from the group of onlookers and crossed the room toward Simon. He raised an eyebrow as she approached, sensing that something was on her mind. "Your Grace," Daphne greeted him, her tone calm but resolute. "Miss Bridgerton," Simon replied with a hint of curiosity. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Daphne glanced around the room, making sure no one was listening too closely, before leaning in slightly. "I have a proposition for you," she said quietly. Simon's eyes narrowed slightly in intrigue. "A proposition?" Daphne nodded. "We both know what it's like to be pursued by suitors we have no interest in. And we both know that no matter how much we resist, society will not leave us alone until we are either married or entirely ruined." Simon's lips twitched in amusement. "I've been fending off such advances for years, Miss Bridgerton. What exactly are you proposing?" Daphne straightened her posture, her expression serious. "I propose that we pretend to court each other." Simon's eyes widened slightly, taken aback by the suggestion. "You're serious?" "Completely," Daphne replied, her voice firm. "If we appear to be courting, it will solve both of our problems. For you, it will keep the matchmaking mamas at bay, and for me, it will make me more desirable to other suitors. After all, if the Duke of Hastings is interested in me, then I must be worth pursuing." Simon studied her for a moment, clearly considering the idea. He had to admit, it was a clever solution to both of their predicaments. By pretending to court Daphne, he could finally get some peace from the relentless advances, and it would give her the boost in reputation she so desperately needed. But there was one problem. "And what of your brother?" Simon asked, raising an eyebrow. "Do you think Anthony will approve of this little arrangement?" Daphne smiled wryly. "Anthony doesn't need to know that it's an arrangement. He'll think it's real, just like the rest of society." Simon chuckled softly, clearly impressed by her boldness. "You certainly have thought this through, haven't you?" "I've had plenty of time to consider my options," Daphne replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "And this is the best one for both of us. It will be a mutually beneficial arrangement, nothing more." Simon hesitated for a moment, weighing the potential risks and rewards of such a plan. On the one hand, he had no interest in marriage, and pretending to court someone seemed like an unnecessary complication. But on the other hand, it was a clever way to fend off the insufferable attention he was constantly subjected to. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Very well, Miss Bridgerton. I agree to your proposal." Daphne's face lit up with relief. "Thank you, Your Grace." "But," Simon added, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there are conditions. This arrangement will be strictly temporary. We will continue the ruse for as long as it is mutually beneficial, but the moment it becomes too complicated, we end it. Agreed? Agreed, Daphne said without hesitation. Good, Simon replied, his gaze sharp. Now, how do you propose we begin this charade? Daphne glanced around the room, noting the curious glances of the other guests. We start now. All we need to do is dance. Simon raised an eyebrow. Dance? Daphne smiled. A waltz, Your Grace. If we are seen dancing together, the rumors will spread like wildfire. Simon gave a small, resigned sigh. Very well, Miss Bridgerton. Shall we? He offered her his arm, and with a confident nod, Daphne accepted. Together, they moved toward the center of the ballroom, where the musicians were beginning the next waltz. As they stepped onto the dance floor, all eyes turned to them, whispers quickly filling the room. Daphne and Simon moved together with practiced ease, their steps perfectly in sync. But while their outward appearances were those of a couple deeply immersed in the moment, their conversation was far from romantic. This will work, Daphne whispered, her gaze scanning the room as they twirled gracefully. Everyone is watching us. Of course they are, Simon replied, his voice low. You're the most talked about debutante of the season. And you're the most eligible bachelor, Daphne added with a smirk. We're giving them exactly what they want. As they continued to dance, Lady Whistledown's ever watchful eye did not miss a single detail. The mysterious gossip columnist would no doubt have much to say about this new development in her next scandal sheet. The next morning, Lady Whistledown's latest column arrived on the doorstep of every household in the ton. In her usual sharp-witted style, she detailed the surprise pairing of the season, Miss Daphne Bridgerton and the Duke of Hastings. The entire city buzzed with curiosity and speculation. Was this the beginning of a love story, or merely another fleeting moment of society's ever-changing whims? But for Daphne and Simon, it was neither. Their arrangement was one of convenience, designed to shield them both from the pressures of the marriage market. Yet, even as the rumors spread and society buzzed with excitement, there was an unspoken tension between them, a tension that neither was quite willing to acknowledge. The game had begun, and with it, the stakes had been raised. But how long could they pretend before the lines between reality and ruse began to blur? Only time would tell. The morning after the Featherington ball, the ton was abuzz with gossip about the unlikely pairing of Daphne Bridgerton and the Duke of Hastings. Whispers of their waltz spread like wildfire, and Lady Whistledown's latest column only added fuel to the flames. With every passing day, more and more eyes followed their every move, and soon, Daphne and Simon became the most talked about couple of the season. For Daphne, the attention was overwhelming. What had started as a clever arrangement to fend off unwanted suitors quickly turned into something much larger, as society's expectations began to weigh heavily on her. Though she knew the courtship was a charade, the ton saw it as a real and imminent match. The pressure to find a suitable husband had always been present, but now, with the Duke seemingly at her side, it was suffocating. Daphne sat in the Bridgerton drawing room, staring down at the latest edition of Lady Whistledown's column. The headline read, "The Unlikely Courtship of Miss Bridgerton and the Duke of Hastings, True Love or a Marriage of Convenience?" Daphne groaned inwardly, folding the paper and tossing it onto the table in front of her. It was as though every move she made was now fodder for society's insatiable appetite for gossip. Violet Bridgerton, her ever-supportive mother, sat across from her, sipping tea with an air of satisfaction. "You mustn't be so upset, Daphne. This is precisely what we wanted, is it not? The Duke is an eligible match, and now all of London is convinced that he's interested in you." Daphne sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that, Mother. This is all moving so quickly. I thought the arrangement would give me more time, but instead, it's only added to the pressure." Violet smiled kindly, reaching out to pat Daphne's hand. "My dear, that's how these things work. The more eligible the match, the higher the expectations. But if you play your cards right, you could have your pick of suitors." "I don't want just any suitor," Daphne replied quietly. "I want a match like you and Father had, one built on love." Violet's expression softened. "And you shall have it, dear. But sometimes love comes from the most unexpected places. Even the Duke of Hastings, for all his stubbornness, could be the right match for you." Daphne glanced out the window, her thoughts drifting to Simon. Their arrangement had been purely transactional, but she couldn't deny that the time they had spent together, while brief, had stirred something within her. It wasn't love, she was certain of that, but there was an undeniable connection between them, a tension that lingered in every conversation, every glance. But Simon had made it clear that he had no intention of marrying, and Daphne wasn't foolish enough to believe that she could change his mind. Theirs was a business deal, nothing more. And yet, the weight of society's expectations made it harder and harder to maintain that facade. Meanwhile, Simon found himself growing increasingly frustrated with the scrutiny that now surrounded him. The arrangement with Daphne had seemed like a clever way to keep the matchmakers at bay, but instead, it had drawn even more attention. Everywhere he went, he was met with knowing smiles, subtle nods, and veiled questions about his intentions toward Miss Bridgerton. That he had no intentions, at least, not the kind society expected of him. His bachelorhood was something he had fought hard to maintain, and he had no desire to be trapped in the confines of marriage. His father's legacy, the bitter resentment he held for the Hastings name, all but ensured that he would never marry, never have children, and never continue the line. And yet, as the days passed and he spent more time with Daphne, Simon couldn't deny that something had shifted. She was unlike the other debutantes, intelligent, sharp-witted, and not easily flustered by his aloofness. Their banter, once a means of maintaining distance, had become a source of genuine enjoyment, and he found himself looking forward to their time together, but that didn't change the fact that he couldn't give her what she wanted. He had no desire to be the object of society's matchmaking schemes, and he certainly wasn't going to allow himself to be pushed into a marriage he didn't want. Simon sat in his study, a tumbler of whiskey in hand, staring out the window at the setting sun. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, and he glanced over his shoulder to see his close friend, Will Mondrich, entering the room. "Well," Will said with a grin, "it seems you've become quite the talk of the town, Your Grace." Simon rolled his eyes, taking a sip of his drink. "Don't remind me." Will chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "I saw Lady Whistledown's latest column. Apparently, Everyone's convinced that you're about to propose to Miss Bridgerton." "They're mistaken," Simon replied flatly. "This is all a ruse to keep the mothers at bay. I have no intention of proposing to anyone." Will raised an eyebrow. "You might want to tell that to the rest of society. From what I've seen, they're already planning the wedding." Simon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This has gotten out of hand. I never should have agreed to this arrangement." "You knew what you were getting into," Will said, though there was a note of understanding in his voice. "The moment you started dancing with Miss Bridgerton, the ton was going to assume it was serious. You've played their game, and now they expect you to follow through." Simon stood, pacing the length of the room. "I don't care what they expect. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I would never marry, and I intend to keep that promise." Will watched him quietly for a moment before speaking again. "You care about her, though." Simon paused, his back to Will. "What?" "Daphne," Will said, his tone thoughtful. "You care about her. I've seen the way you look at her, the way you talk to her. This isn't just some convenient arrangement for you." Simon's jaw clenched, his thoughts racing. Will's words struck a chord, one that Simon wasn't ready to acknowledge. He did care about Daphne, more than he was willing to admit. But caring about her wasn't enough. He couldn't give her what she wanted, what she deserved. And he wasn't about to let himself get trapped in a situation that would only lead to heartache for both of them. "This is temporary," Simon said firmly, more to himself than to Will. "The moment it stops being beneficial, it ends." Will didn't press the issue, though there was a knowing look in his eyes. "Just be careful, Simon. These things have a way of becoming more complicated than you expect." Simon nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't let his feelings for Daphne cloud his judgment. The arrangement had to remain just that, an arrangement that as the days passed, the gossip surrounding Daphne and Simon only intensified. Every ball, every gathering was an opportunity for society to speculate on the nature of their relationship. Lady Whistledown's columns became increasingly pointed, hinting at the possibility of an impending engagement, but beneath the surface, both Daphne and Simon were struggling with their own internal battles. Daphne felt the crushing weight of society's expectations, the pressure to find a husband, and the growing uncertainty about her future. Simon, on the other hand, remained resolute in his refusal to marry, though his feelings for Daphne continued to complicate matters. The ton watched with bated breath, waiting for the next chapter in the story of Miss Bridgerton and the Duke of Hastings. But for Daphne and Simon, the stakes were higher than anyone else could imagine. They were playing a dangerous game, one that neither of them could afford to lose. The question was, how long could they keep up the charade before it all came crashing down? The charade continued, much to the delight of London society. Daphne and Simon found themselves attending a flurry of balls, dinners, and garden parties, their every interaction scrutinized by the ton. Each event became an intricate performance, where feigned glances, subtle touches, and carefully rehearsed words painted the picture of a budding romance. They had mastered the art of deception, but what neither anticipated was how real the act would start to feel. It began at the Montrose ball, where the opulence of the season's most anticipated event reached dizzying heights. The grand ballroom shimmered with candlelight, and every corner was filled with the finest members of the ton, eager to witness the courtship of the Duke of Hastings and Miss Daphne Bridgerton unfold before their very eyes. Daphne stood near the entrance, adjusting her gloves as she scanned the crowd. Her smile was polished, the kind expected of a young lady being courted by a duke. Yet beneath the surface, her nerves buzzed. She knew the role she had to play, but every time she stood beside Simon, the weight of pretending seemed heavier. Her thoughts were interrupted by Simon's arrival. He cut a dashing figure as always, his black coat tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders, his expression cool and unreadable. He approached her with a slow, deliberate stride, and the room fell silent as whispers began to circulate. They were the couple of the season, the perfect match, or so everyone believed. Miss Bridgerton, Simon greeted her, his voice low and smooth, though there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You look radiant this evening." "Your Grace," Daphne replied, her voice steady, though her heart quickened slightly. "You are too kind." With a gentle bow, Simon extended his hand, a clear invitation to join him on the dance floor. Daphne hesitated for only a moment before accepting, and together they made their way to the center of the room. The crowd parted, allowing them space as the first notes of the waltz began to play. As they moved in perfect harmony, their bodies swaying in time with the music, the world around them faded into the background. Their steps were effortless, the result of countless dances performed together, but tonight, something felt different. "You've become quite the dancer," Simon remarked, his tone teasing but soft as they twirled across the floor. "Perhaps I have a skilled partner to thank for that," Daphne responded with a sly smile, meeting his gaze. Their banter was easy, as it had always been, but the tension that simmered just beneath the surface was undeniable. It had been growing with each passing day, each forced interaction, until now, it hovered between them like an unspoken truth. Daphne could feel the heat of Simon's hand on her back, the firmness of his grip as he led her across the floor. It was all for show, a performance designed to fool those watching, but the way his eyes lingered on hers for just a beat too long, it felt real, and it wasn't just Daphne who felt it. Simon, too, was struggling to maintain the facade. He had agreed to this arrangement to protect himself from the very thing that was now creeping into his thoughts, attachment. But with every glance, every touch, the walls he had so carefully built around himself seemed to weaken. "Do you think they believe it?" Daphne whispered as they spun gracefully around the room. Simon raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a half-smile. "The ton is a rather gullible lot, Miss Bridgerton. I'm sure they've already imagined our wedding." Daphne chuckled, but there was a trace of nervousness in her laughter. The dance of deception had been easy at first, but now it felt like they were both teetering on the edge of something more. As the waltz came to an end, the applause from the crowd brought them back to reality. Simon stepped back, releasing Daphne's hand with a practiced bow. The performance was over, but the lingering tension remained. As the night wore on, Daphne found herself in the company of her family, listening half-heartedly as her mother and Lady Danbury discussed the season's latest developments. But her thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the whirlwind of emotions that her fake courtship with Simon had stirred. What had once been an arrangement of convenience now felt far more complicated. She told herself it was all for show, that the warmth in Simon's gaze, the way her heart raced when he was near, was simply part of the ruse. But deep down, she knew it was more. Across the room, Simon stood by a group of gentlemen, laughing politely at some shared jest, though his eyes were always drawn back to Daphne. He had been fooling himself for weeks, telling himself that this was just another social obligation, that his feelings for her were no different than those for any other acquaintance. But the truth was undeniable. He was drawn to her, in a way he hadn't expected, in a way he didn't want to admit. They were both dancing on the edge of something dangerous. And neither was ready to fall. In the days that followed, their performance continued at various society events. Garden parties, dinners, more balls, each occasion brought them together again, and each time, the lines between pretend and reality blurred further. The chemistry between them was palpable, though neither was willing to admit it aloud. Lady Whistledown, ever the keen observer, continued to document their every move, fueling the gossip with pointed commentary on their so-called love affair. Her latest column speculated on the inevitable proposal, fanning the flames of society's expectations, and yet, despite the growing pressure, Daphne and Simon remained locked in their game of deception. Their witty banter and public displays of affection only served to deepen the intrigue, but behind closed doors, both struggled with the truth of their feelings. At one such gathering, held at the grand estate of Lord and Lady Berbrook, the charade reached new heights. Simon and Daphne found themselves standing on a balcony, away from the prying eyes of the ton, sharing a rare moment of privacy. "It seems our plan is working too well," Daphne said quietly, her gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens below. Simon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The ton is convinced that we're on the brink of an engagement." Daphne hesitated before speaking again, her voice softer this time. "And what do you think?" Simon turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching hers. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension, the unspoken truth hanging in the balance. "I think," Simon began, his voice low and measured, "that we are both playing a dangerous game." Daphne's heart fluttered, but she forced herself to remain composed. "Perhaps. But we agreed to this, didn't we? We agreed that it would only be for a time, until it was no longer beneficial." Simon's gaze softened, but his resolve remained. "Yes, we did." Silence stretched between them, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the world had shrunk to just the two of them. The fake courtship, the rumors, the expectations of society, all of it seemed distant, inconsequential compared to the truth that simmered beneath the surface, but neither of them could admit it. Not yet. The night drew to a close. Daphne and Simon rejoined the crowd, their masks firmly in place once more. The dance of deception continued, with no end in sight. But the stakes were growing higher, and with every passing day, the risk of their true feelings being revealed loomed larger. The ton might be convinced of their impending engagement, but Daphne and Simon knew the truth. They were walking a fine line between pretense and reality, and sooner or later, one of them would have to make a choice. But for now, the dance went on. The sun rose over London, casting a soft glow on the cobblestone streets as ladies and gentlemen prepared for another day of social engagements. Yet, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation, for Lady Whistledown's latest column had just hit the stands. Whispers filled the air as the ton gathered in drawing rooms and tea houses, eager to dissect the latest gossip. Daphne sat in her family's parlor, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. Her mother, Lady Violet, flitted about the room, organizing various items for an upcoming soiree, while her younger siblings played nearby. Despite the usual bustle, Daphne felt a strange heaviness settle over her as she awaited the inevitable comments regarding the column. "Have you seen today's Whistledown?" one of her sisters, Eloise, exclaimed, bursting into the room with the newspaper in hand. "It's positively scandalous." Daphne felt her heart race as she reached for the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. She scanned the column quickly, and her breath caught in her throat at the words laid before her. "It appears our dear Miss Bridgerton has found herself quite enamored with the Duke of Hastings. The lovely lady seems to have lost her heart to the most notorious bachelor in all of London. Perhaps love is not the only thing that can flourish at a ball." Daphne's cheeks flushed with heat, a mix of embarrassment and confusion swirling within her. The rest of the column continued with veiled comments about their apparent affections, leaving little doubt about Lady Whistledown's insinuations. "Daphne, are you all right?" Eloise asked, her brow furrowed with concern as she noticed her sister's pale complexion. "Fine, just surprised," Daphne replied, forcing a smile. "It's only Lady Whistledown's usual dramatics." But as she tried to brush it off, the words echoed in her mind. Was it true? Had her feelings for Simon truly grown beyond their pretense? The realization sent a thrill through her that she couldn't ignore, but the weight of society's expectations bore down on her shoulders. Later that afternoon, Daphne found herself walking in the garden, seeking solace among the blooming roses and lush greenery. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a dappled pattern on the ground, yet her mind was anything but tranquil. The whispers of the ton, the laughter of her siblings, even the chirping of birds seemed to fade into the background as she grappled with the thoughts racing through her mind. She had entered this season hoping to find a match based on love, yet here she was, embroiled in a scheme with the very man who had once declared his disdain for matrimony. Simon's charm had captivated her, and their banter had brought her joy, but was it truly love that had sparked in her heart, or merely the thrill of their deception? "What a delightful sight you make, Miss Bridgerton," came a smooth voice from behind her. Daphne turned to see Simon approaching, his expression playful, though she couldn't help but notice a hint of concern in his eyes. "A garden suits you. The flowers pale in comparison." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "I was just reflecting on Lady Whistledown's latest column." "Ah," Simon said, his tone turning serious. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before she took aim at us." Daphne inhaled sharply, unable to meet his gaze. "It's rather scandalous, don't you think? The way she insinuates things. It leaves me questioning everything." "Do not let her words dictate your feelings," Simon urged, stepping closer. "Gossip is fickle, and the ton thrives on it. What matters is what we know to be true." But what was true? Daphne wanted to believe Simon, to trust her heart, but uncertainty gripped her. "And what is that, Simon? What is true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, searching her face as if trying to unravel the complexities of her thoughts. "That we are both playing a part in this charade," he replied slowly. "But perhaps there's more at play than either of us anticipated." The words hung in the air, laden with meaning. Daphne felt a pang in her chest at the thought. Could she truly harbor feelings for the Duke, or was it merely the thrill of their game? She felt lost in a whirlwind of emotions, torn between societal expectations and her growing affection for the man standing before her. "Perhaps we should consider a different approach," Simon suggested, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "A way to dispel the rumors without losing our heads." Daphne raised an eyebrow, intrigued yet cautious. "What do you have in mind?" "Why not hold a public outing?" he proposed, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "An event that will put all speculation to rest. A picnic, perhaps, where we can interact freely in front of the ton. They'll see it's merely a facade." "A picnic?" Daphne echoed, her heart racing at the prospect. It sounded innocuous enough, but would it truly quell the rumors? "Do you think it will work?" "Absolutely," Simon said with a confidence that made her stomach flutter. "And in the process, we may even have a bit of fun." As they spoke, Daphne felt her resolve strengthening. Maybe embracing the charade could provide clarity. But the closer they drew to the picnic, the more she knew that their time together would only serve to amplify her conflicting feelings. "Very well, Your Grace," she finally agreed, a smile breaking through her uncertainty. "Let's have our picnic and see what happens." Simon returned her smile, and for a brief moment, all her worries faded away. But as she walked alongside him back into the house, the weight of Lady Whistledown's words lingered in the back of her mind, reminding her that no matter how much fun they had, the reality of their situation was still fraught with complications. That evening, as Daphne lay in bed, she replayed the day's events in her mind. Her heart was a tumult of emotions: fear, excitement, confusion. Lady Whistledown had struck a nerve, and the implications of her words gnawed at her conscience. Was she truly in love with Simon? Or was she simply caught up in the moment, swept away by the excitement of their arrangement? The answers eluded her as sleep began to claim her, but one thing was certain: the upcoming picnic would test the limits of their deception, and perhaps unveil the truth of what lay beneath the surface of their carefully constructed facade. With that thought, Daphne drifted into a restless slumber, the echo of Lady Whistledown's voice swirling in her mind. The day of the picnic dawned bright and warm, with the sun shining down on the lush grounds of the Bridgerton estate. The garden was a tapestry of vibrant flowers, their colors almost dazzling against the azure sky. Daphne's family had worked tirelessly to prepare for the gathering, inviting several members of the ton to join in the festivities, all while keeping the focus on the ruse that had begun to feel like so much more. Simon arrived shortly after noon, his usual air of confidence slightly tempered by an unusual sense of anticipation. He had made a commitment to himself, to keep Daphne at arm's length, to remain steadfast in his bachelorhood. Yet, with each passing day, each stolen glance, that resolve grew weaker, and he found himself drawn to her in a way he had never anticipated. As he stepped from his carriage, Simon adjusted his cravat and scanned the gathering guests. The sight of Daphne among her family instantly pulled him in. She wore a soft yellow dress that highlighted the warmth of her complexion and seemed to catch the sun, making her radiate with an almost ethereal glow. Her laughter floated through the air like music, drawing the attention of those around her, but it was Simon who felt an inexplicable connection, a tether that seemed to bind them closer with each interaction, or grace. Daphne called out, breaking from a conversation with her mother to meet him halfway. The joy in her voice brought a smile to Simon's lips. "Miss Bridgerton," he replied, bowing slightly, his heart racing as he took in the sight of her. "You look quite fetching today." "Thank you," she said, her cheeks flushing under his gaze. "I hope you're ready for the festivities. We have games and refreshments prepared, and my brothers have promised to entertain." "Entertainment sounds promising," Simon remarked, a teasing smile playing on his lips. "Shall I brace myself for your brother's competitive spirit?" Daphne laughed, a melodious sound that sent a jolt of warmth through Simon. "Yes, you might want to. But I promise, it will be fun." As the picnic unfolded, Simon found himself engaging in the planned activities, attempting to maintain his playful demeanor. He participated in a series of games with the guests, all while keeping a watchful eye on Daphne. She was a whirlwind of energy, darting from one group to another, her laughter infectious. It was a side of her that he hadn't seen before, unrestrained and free. And it ignited something within him that he had thought long extinguished. As the afternoon progressed, Simon and Daphne found themselves in a quieter corner of the garden, watching the merriment unfold around them. A group of gentlemen were competing in a game of croquet, and the laughter of the onlookers filled the air, but Simon's attention was solely on Daphne. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked, leaning closer, his voice low enough to keep their conversation private amidst the noise of the crowd. "I am," she replied, her eyes sparkling with delight. "It's nice to see everyone having fun, isn't it?" "It is," Simon agreed, though his mind was preoccupied with the soft glow of her skin in the afternoon light and the way her laughter lingered in the air. "You've outdone yourself, Miss Bridgerton." Daphne smiled shyly, and for a moment, the laughter and chatter faded into the background as they shared a moment of unspoken understanding. But the weight of their arrangement began to creep into Simon's mind, and he felt a pang of guilt for the feelings that were forming. "Simon," she said, breaking the moment, "I wanted to thank you for agreeing to this. I know it must be exhausting, pretending to court me." "On the contrary," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. "I find it quite entertaining." But even as he spoke, he felt a sense of unease. Was he truly enjoying it, or was he merely trying to convince himself of that fact? Daphne tilted her head slightly, her expression curious. "You're not just saying that to appease me, are you?" "Of course not," Simon said, his brow furrowing slightly. "This is," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's not without its challenges, but you make it interesting." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the garden, Simon's internal struggle intensified. He had always prided himself on his independence, on the control he maintained over his life. But with Daphne, he felt himself slipping into unfamiliar territory. The feelings he had long pushed aside began to resurface, complicating their fake relationship in ways he had never anticipated. "Simon," Daphne spoke again, her voice softer this time, I hope this arrangement hasn't made things awkward between us. I enjoy our time together, even if it is for show. Neither of us is being forced into this, he assured her, though he felt the weight of his own words. We're simply playing our parts. But as he said it, he couldn't shake the sense that there was something more brewing beneath the surface, something that could shatter the fragile balance they had created. Is it truly just a game for you? Daphne asked, her gaze searching his. Simon opened his mouth to respond but faltered. The truth was, he was beginning to feel something real, something terrifyingly deep for the woman before him. He had tried to keep his heart locked away, shielded from the perils of love, yet with each smile, each shared moment, that resolve crumbled a little more. Daphne, he started, but a loud cheer erupted from the croquet field, interrupting him. Daphne turned, momentarily distracted by the commotion, and Simon seized the opportunity to collect his thoughts. He couldn't let her see how vulnerable he felt. She deserved more than a man conflicted by his own emotions. I suppose we should join the others, he said, attempting to steer the conversation back to safe ground. Of course, she replied, though he caught the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. As they walked back toward the gathering, Simon's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. This charade they had embarked upon was meant to protect them both from the expectations of society, yet he found himself at a crossroads. Could he continue to pretend, knowing that his heart was slowly betraying him? The remainder of the picnic passed in a blur. Laughter and camaraderie surrounded them, but Simon felt the distance growing between him and Daphne. He couldn't shake the feeling that their time together was shifting, transforming into something far more complicated than he had ever planned. As dusk approached and the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Simon knew he had to make a decision. The more he fell for Daphne, the harder it would be to extricate himself from the web of emotions he had woven around them. He watched her from across the garden, her silhouette framed by the twilight, and realized that no matter how hard he tried to deny it, he was falling fast and hard for the very woman he had sworn to keep at bay. It was time to confront the truth. No more games. But as he stood at the precipice of his feelings, he couldn't help but wonder if he had the strength to embrace what lay ahead, or if he would lose the very thing he had come to cherish. The following week, the Bridgerton estate hosted a lavish garden party, inviting the cream of London society to enjoy an afternoon filled with music, laughter, and delicate pastries. The vibrant blooms surrounding the festivities created a picturesque backdrop, yet an undercurrent of tension seemed to weave through the air, especially between Simon and Daphne. As guests mingled, Simon stood slightly apart, watching the gathering with a bemused expression. His heart was in turmoil, each beat echoing his internal struggle. The knowledge that his feelings for Daphne had grown beyond mere attraction plagued him. He had entered into this arrangement with the intention of keeping her at a distance, yet every glance, every shared moment, had drawn them closer, and it terrified him. Daphne flitted about the garden, her laughter bright and engaging as she interacted with the other guests. The sight of her, vibrant and unrestrained, filled him with a mixture of admiration and frustration. Why couldn't he simply allow himself to feel what he felt? Why did he insist on pushing her away? "Your Grace, it appears you're in need of some company," came a voice from behind him. It was Anthony, Daphne's older brother, a teasing glint in his eye. Simon turned, forcing a smile. "Just observing," my lord. Ah, yes. A spectator, as always, Anthony remarked, folding his arms. Perhaps it's time you joined the festivities. You do have a lovely lady vying for your attention, you know. I'm aware, Simon replied, glancing toward Daphne. She was speaking animatedly to a group of debutantes, her expression animated and full of life. But I believe it's best if I keep my distance. Anthony raised an eyebrow, his demeanor shifting to one of concern. You're pushing her away, Simon. If you care for her, I don't, Simon snapped, a touch more forcefully than intended. The truth was, he felt a deep-seated yearning for Daphne, but admitting it to himself, or to anyone else, was far too daunting. Your actions tell a different story, Anthony countered, his tone steady. You may think you're doing her a favor, but it's clear to everyone that you are drawn to her. Simon felt irritation simmer beneath the surface, the tension between them palpable. What would you have me do? Declare my feelings for her when I am not ready for such a commitment? To risk everything for something that may be a mere folly? Before Anthony could respond, Daphne approached, her face bright with enthusiasm, and Simon felt his resolve waver. Simon, she called, her voice cutting through his inner turmoil. Come join us. We're discussing the most absurd gossip circulating through the ton. More gossip, he replied, trying to keep his tone light despite the weight of their earlier conversation. Yes. I think Lady Whistledown has taken a particular interest in our gathering, Daphne said with a grin, her eyes sparkling. You should hear the latest scandal, it's utterly ridiculous. But as she spoke, Simon's heart sank. He knew Lady Whistledown's ink had been running wild, making sport of their arrangement and distorting the truth. Perhaps it's best to ignore her nonsense, he replied, not masking his irritation. Why? You'd rather sulk over there? Daphne asked, her brow furrowing in disbelief. This is a celebration, Simon. You should at least pretend to enjoy it. I'm not sulking, Daphne, he shot back, his voice rising in volume. I'm merely attempting to maintain some semblance of dignity in the face of relentless gossip. Daphne's expression shifted, her features hardening. You're treating this like a burden, and I'm tired of it. If you want this charade to work, then you need to commit to it fully. Commit? To what? A farce? Simon exclaimed, drawing the attention of nearby guests. He could see curious glances darting their way, but he couldn't care less. You want me to play the part of your devoted suitor while I grapple with my own feelings? Yes. Because maybe you don't realize how much you mean to me. Daphne shot back, her voice rising. The honesty in her statement struck him, but before he could respond, she continued. You think this is easy for me? You think I don't feel the weight of everyone's expectations? I never asked you to, then what do you want, Simon? Daphne interrupted, her voice laced with frustration. Do you want to keep pretending? Because I can't do this anymore. I can't stand the way you push me away while we pretend everything is fine. Simon felt the ground shift beneath him, her words striking a chord he could no longer ignore. I'm not pushing you away, he replied, softer now but still edged with tension. I'm trying to protect both of us. From what? She demanded, her eyes fierce. From happiness? From the possibility of something real? The garden seemed to fade into the background, the laughter of the guests becoming a distant hum as they stood locked in a fierce standoff, the air charged with unspoken feelings. Simon's chest tightened, every word he wanted to say caught in his throat. He took a step back, the weight of the moment pressing heavily upon him. Daphne, you don't understand. I can't allow myself to feel this way. Not now. Why not? She pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. Because you fear what it might mean. Yes, he exploded, the honesty tearing from him. Because it terrifies me. The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, guests exchanged glances, some whispering, others trying to resume their conversations, but the tension between Simon and Daphne held them captive. Daphne's expression shifted, her fierce demeanor faltering for a moment as she absorbed his admission. Terrifies you? She repeated, her voice a soft whisper. Then why do you continue this charade with me? Because I can't stand the thought of losing you, he shouted, the words spilling forth before he could contain them. Her eyes widened, the fire of their argument replaced by shock. You mean, you care? Of course I care. Simon replied, his frustration morphing into vulnerability. But I'm not the man you deserve. I don't want to be the reason for your heartbreak. And yet here we are, both caught in this web of our own making, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. It's suffocating. The realization hit Simon hard, the weight of their circumstances crashing down upon him. Their charade had spiraled into something far more complicated than he had ever intended. I don't want to hurt you, Daphne, he admitted, his voice low and sincere. Then stop pushing me away, she replied, her tone softening. If you feel something for me, admit it. Let's face whatever this is together. Simon hesitated, the war within him raging still. It's not that simple. It could be, she urged, stepping closer, the vulnerability in her eyes disarming him. But only if you let it be. At that moment, the tension hung between them like a fragile thread, their gazes locked in an unspoken understanding. The world around them faded, and for the first time, Simon felt the weight of his choices pressing down, urging him to take a leap of faith, but before he could respond, Lady Whistledown's unmistakable voice drifted through the garden, cutting through the silence like a knife. Ah, it appears that the Duke and Miss Bridgerton are in the midst of a rather heated discussion. I wonder if it's the sort of conversation that would endear them to the ton or render them scandalous figures in society's eyes. The moment shattered as the guests turned their attention toward them, curiosity and intrigue etched on their faces. Simon felt the heat of embarrassment flood his cheeks, realizing they had become the center of attention, a spectacle for all to see. Lady Whistledown is going to have a field day with this, Simon muttered, frustration bubbling beneath the surface once more. Daphne sighed, the tension between them momentarily forgotten in the wake of their exposure. Perhaps it's time we decide what we truly want. The laughter and chatter resumed around them, but Simon's heart raced as he realized their moment of honesty had been interrupted, and the stakes had risen higher than ever. They were trapped in a web of expectations, their feelings intertwined with the scrutiny of society, and now they had to navigate the fallout together. As they stood in the garden, the distance between them felt insurmountable once again. But beneath the chaos, Simon knew they were on the precipice of something that could change everything, if only they had the courage to embrace it. The air in the Bridgerton drawing room was thick with tension as Daphne perched on the edge of a luxurious settee, her fingers nervously twisting the delicate lace of her gloves. The morning's newspapers had arrived, and with them came the latest gossip, stirring a storm of whispers throughout the ton. Daphne could feel the weight of those whispers pressing down on her, each rumor sharper than the last. "Have you seen Lady Whistledown's latest column?" one of Daphne's friends exclaimed, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. "She's claimed that our dear Daphne is simply desperate for a proposal." Daphne's heart sank. It was one thing to be the subject of admiration, but to be labeled desperate was a new low. Desperate? How absurd, she retorted, trying to mask her dismay with bravado. "I hardly think Lady Whistledown's opinion matters in the grand scheme of things." "Perhaps not, but you must admit that her words carry weight. The way she spins her tales can alter reputations in a heartbeat," another friend added, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in with further news. As the chatter continued around her, Daphne couldn't help but feel isolated. Her friends, once a source of comfort and camaraderie, now seemed preoccupied with their own prospects, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her association with Simon. The revelation of their staged courtship had sent ripples through society, and now every eye was scrutinizing her with suspicion. Meanwhile, in a nearby club, Simon sat surrounded by his fellow peers, a glass of scotch in hand but little interest in drinking. He had overheard snippets of conversation as he entered, and now he felt the palpable tension as his friends exchanged glances laden with speculation. "Simon, my good man," one of them, a tall gentleman with a penchant for sarcasm, said, raising an eyebrow. "I hear you're quite the scandalous figure these days. Is it true? Are you courting the Bridgerton girl, or is this all merely a ruse?" Simon felt his jaw tighten. "It's a ruse, nothing more," he replied curtly, irritation flaring within him. "Daphne and I are merely maintaining appearances." The others snickered, clearly entertained by the unfolding drama. "Ah, but appearances can be deceiving, can they not? Perhaps you've fallen under her spell," another chimed in, a teasing lilt in his voice. "If you don't mind my saying so, she's quite a catch." "And yet you refuse to marry," a more serious voice interjected, looking Simon squarely in the eye. "Why is that? You seem determined to keep your distance from what could be a promising union." Simon's gaze hardened. "You don't know the circumstances of my past," he replied, feeling the familiar anger rise within him. "My reasons are my own, and they have nothing to do with Daphne." "Or do they?" the first gentleman mused, swirling the contents of his glass. "Perhaps you're afraid of what might happen if you let her in. A true match could change everything for you." As their jests continued, Simon found himself growing more agitated. He had spent years building walls around his heart, convinced that love and marriage were things best left untouched. The ghosts of his past loomed large, whispering warnings in his ear that threatened to undo him. Back at the Bridgerton estate, Daphne found herself cornered by her mother, who had just returned from an afternoon visit to a nearby estate. "Daphne, dear, we need to discuss your prospects," Lady Bridgerton said, her tone serious. "The rumors surrounding you are getting out of hand. We must act quickly." "I'm aware of the rumors, Mother," Daphne replied, her frustration bubbling over. "But I refuse to let Lady Whistledown dictate my worth. Just because she's chosen to make sport of me does not mean I will play along." Lady Bridgerton sighed, her expression softening. "I understand your feelings, but the realities of our world are harsh. The Ton will not hesitate to judge you based on these whispers, and your chances at a good match could vanish if you don't tread carefully." "I don't want a match based on rumors and gossip," Daphne said, her voice rising. "I want something real, something genuine." "Then perhaps you need to consider how you're perceived," her mother advised gently. "There are suitors lined up, but they grow impatient, and Simon's hesitance does not help your cause." Daphne's heart sank at the thought of losing Simon. Despite their rocky interactions, she felt an undeniable connection that was worth fighting for. "Mother, I can't simply abandon my feelings for him. He may be reluctant, but he is not the man they think he is." "Then you must show the world that you are worthy of a suitor's attention," Lady Bridgerton urged. "You need to prove to them, and to Simon, that you are not just a fleeting fancy, but a woman of substance." "Easier said than done," Daphne murmured, her mind racing. She was caught between societal expectations and her burgeoning feelings for Simon, leaving her feeling more lost than ever. That evening, as Daphne prepared for yet another ball, the gravity of her situation weighed heavily upon her. The fear of being judged loomed large, and with each moment that passed, she felt the pressure of expectation tightening its grip. As she stared into the mirror, she tried to summon the confidence she desperately needed. "I will not be defined by rumors," she vowed softly, straightening her spine. "I will show them that I am worthy of love." But beneath her resolve, Daphne felt a deepening uncertainty about Simon's intentions. Could he truly let go of his past? And if not, would she be forced to navigate this marriage market alone? Meanwhile, Simon remained at the club, grappling with his own tumultuous thoughts. The weight of his past pressed heavily on him, filling him with an overwhelming fear of failure. The memories of a family shattered by love haunted him, whispering the same refrain, "Never marry, never love." But the image of Daphne, the way she smiled, the fire in her eyes, challenged his long-held beliefs. As he sipped his scotch, he wrestled with the truth that threatened to unravel him. As rumors continued to swirl and revelations loomed on the horizon, both Simon and Daphne found themselves standing at a crossroads, faced with choices that could change the course of their lives forever. Would they be brave enough to confront their fears and embrace what was blossoming between them, or would the shadows of their pasts prove too great a burden to bear? The evening was sultry, and the air in the Bridgerton ballroom hung heavy with anticipation. Guests mingled, laughter and music weaving together to create an atmosphere that should have been joyous. Yet, for Daphne, the vibrant colors and swirling skirts only served to heighten the tension that had settled in her chest. She had watched Simon across the room, engaged in casual banter with his friends, a charming smile plastered on his face. But beneath that facade lay a resistance that she could no longer ignore. The games they had played were beginning to feel like a facade as fragile as the finest crystal. "Daphne," her mother called, pulling her from her reverie. "You should speak with Mr. Basset. He looks quite lost in thought." Daphne's heart raced. "I intend to, mother." With a determined stride, she crossed the room, her heart pounding with each step. When she reached Simon, he looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Daphne," he greeted, his tone light but his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart fluttering. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, and now that it was here, doubt crept in. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. "Not really," she admitted, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "I need to understand what's going on between us." He shifted, his usual charm fading as the weight of her words settled over him. "There's nothing going on that you need to concern yourself with, Daphne. Don't pretend," she urged, a fire igniting within her. "We both know this isn't just a game anymore. You feel it, too. So why do you resist?" Simon hesitated, his gaze drifting away from hers, as if searching for the right words. "It's complicated," he finally said, his voice strained. "Complicated?" Daphne echoed, frustration bubbling over. "You keep saying that. What does that even mean? Are you afraid of what others think? Or is it something deeper?" He flinched, and she could see the struggle etched across his face. "It's not about what others think," he said quietly. "You wouldn't understand. My past, I want to understand." Daphne interrupted, her voice rising above the chatter around them. "You don't have to keep hiding from me, Simon. If we are to have any hope of something real, you need to let me in." For a moment, they stood there, tension crackling in the air between them. Simon's walls were sturdy, but Daphne felt the cracks begin to show. "You think I'm afraid?" he asked, his voice low but fierce. "I think you're terrified," she replied, her heart pounding. "You've built this wall around yourself, and I can't reach you through it. You need to let me in, Simon. You need to trust me." The anger flickered in his eyes, but beneath it was a storm of emotion that made her heart ache for him. "It's not that simple, Daphne. I can't just." "Why not?" she pressed, stepping closer, her voice softer now. "What happened to you? You don't have to share it all, but you need to at least tell me why you're so resistant to love." He took a deep breath, running a hand through his dark hair, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. "It's a long story, and it's not one I'm proud of. I've seen what love can do to people, the way it can break you. My father," his voice cracked, and he looked away, the pain evident in his eyes. Daphne's heart twisted in sympathy. "What did he do?" "Love destroyed him," Simon said bitterly, his jaw tightening. "He was a good man, but the moment he fell in love, he became someone else entirely. He lost everything, his dignity, his honor. I watched him suffer, and I swore I would never let that happen to me." Daphne felt her heart ache for him, understanding dawning in her mind. "You think that by avoiding love, you're protecting yourself. But in doing so, you're also shutting out the chance for happiness, for something beautiful." He looked at her, vulnerability shining through the cracks in his armor. "I'm not like you, Daphne. You believe in love and fairy tales. I've seen the dark side of it. Maybe it's time you let go of that darkness," she said, her voice steady. "You deserve to find joy. We could find it together if you would only give us a chance." Simon turned away, grappling with her words, the pain of his past clashing with the hope she offered. "I don't want to hurt you," he finally said, his voice low and raw. "You already are by pushing me away," she countered, her heart racing. "You have to face this, Simon. You have to confront your fears." He faced her again, his expression torn between longing and fear. "And what if I fail?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we will figure it out together," she replied, stepping even closer, her resolve strengthening. "But if you continue to resist, we'll never know what we could have. Don't you see? Love is worth the risk, even with all its uncertainties." In that moment, a flicker of understanding passed between them. The ballroom, filled with laughter and music, faded away, leaving just the two of them in their fragile bubble of connection. Simon's defenses began to crumble as he felt the warmth of her gaze envelop him, igniting something deep within. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Then let me help you," Daphne urged, her heart laid bare before him. "Take a chance. With me." For a long moment, Simon stood still, his mind racing as he processed her words. The shadows of his past loomed large, but the light in Daphne's eyes shone brighter. He felt the pull toward her, a magnetic force that threatened to topple the walls he had so carefully constructed. "I need time," he said finally, his voice rough. "I need to confront my demons." Daphne nodded, her heart fluttering with hope. "Then take that time. But don't take too long, Simon. I won't wait forever." With that, she stepped back, leaving him standing alone amidst the swirling crowd, uncertainty etched on his face. As she rejoined her friends, Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a breakthrough, yet the path ahead remained steep and fraught with danger. Simon watched her go, his heart heavy with conflict. The promise of love beckoned him, yet the ghosts of his past threatened to pull him under. He was teetering on the edge of something beautiful but frightening, and for the first time in years, he wondered if perhaps it was time to leap. As the music swelled around him, Simon knew he faced a pivotal moment in his life. Could he embrace the possibility of love, or would he allow his fears to dictate his fate? The heart of the matter lay before him, raw and real, waiting for him to take the plunge. The air was thick with tension, the sun barely rising as a gray dawn broke over the outskirts of town. The field, usually quiet and peaceful, now played host to a drama as old as time itself. Two figures stood at opposite ends, pistols in hand, the weight of their choices resting heavily on their shoulders. Anthony Bridgerton, Daphne's protective older brother, stood tall and resolute, his face a mask of fury. Across from him, Simon Basset, the Duke of Hastings, wore an expression of grim determination. This was not how Simon had expected his morning to begin, but there was no avoiding it now. He had crossed a line, and Anthony was determined to make him pay for it. "I told you," Anthony growled, his voice cutting through the silence. "You were to stay away from my sister." Simon remained silent, his grip tightening on the pistol in his hand. The morning fog clung to the grass, the chill seeping through his coat. He had known this moment was inevitable. The truth had come out, their courtship, once meant to be a farce, had turned into something much more real. And in the eyes of society, Simon had compromised Daphne. "This is madness," muttered Colin, watching the two from the sidelines. Benedict stood beside him, equally tense, but they both knew better than to intervene now. Anthony was dead set on defending Daphne's honor. On the other side of the field, Daphne arrived in a frantic rush, her heart pounding. "No," she called out, her voice breathless as she ran across the damp grass. Her dress, hastily thrown on, billowed behind her as she reached the spot between the two men. "Stop this. You can't do this." Anthony's expression darkened. "Daphne, leave. This has nothing to do with you." "Of course it has everything to do with me," Daphne cried, her voice breaking. She looked between the two men, her heart racing with fear and frustration. "You can't just duel over me like I'm some prize to be fought for." "Step aside, Daphne," Anthony said through gritted teeth, his face hard with determination. "This is the only way to settle this." Simon lowered his pistol slightly, his gaze softening as he looked at Daphne. "He's right, Daphne. This is between us." "No," she said firmly, standing her ground. "This is absurd. You both know it. We're not living in some romantic tragedy where duels decide a woman's fate." Her eyes blazed with anger as she stared down her brother. "You think this will protect me? It will ruin everything." Anthony hesitated, the force of her words striking him hard. But he refused to back down. "He's dishonored you, Daphne. Everyone knows it. This is the only way to restore our family's reputation." Tears stung Daphne's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And what about me, Anthony? Do I have no say in my own future?" "You deserve better than him," Anthony replied coldly, his gaze shifting toward Simon. "You deserve someone who won't toy with your affections." Simon stepped forward, his voice calm but pained. "I never intended to hurt her. You know that." Daphne spun around to face Simon, her frustration bubbling over. "Then why are you letting this happen? Why are you still fighting this battle when you know what's between us is real?" Simon's face fell. "Because I'm not the man you think I am, Daphne. You deserve better than me." "I'll decide who I deserve," Daphne shot back, her voice fierce. "I love you, Simon." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone, including Simon. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Daphne's declaration pierced through the layers of doubt and self-loathing that had weighed him down for so long. Anthony's face hardened, but his grip on the pistol loosened. "Daphne, you don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do," she said, her voice strong. "I know exactly what I'm saying. This has gone far enough." Simon's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of Daphne's words, the truth of them resonating within him. But the fear that he wasn't enough for her, that his past would only bring her pain, was still there, gnawing at him. "I can't," he whispered, shaking his head. "I can't give you what you deserve, Daphne." "You can," she insisted, stepping closer to him. "You just have to let go of your past." The tension was palpable, and Anthony watched the exchange in silence, his grip on the pistol finally slackening. He saw the way Daphne looked at Simon, the fierce, determined love in her eyes, and it struck him deep. He realized, with a sinking heart, that no duel could solve this. His sister had already made her choice. Anthony took a deep breath, lowering his pistol completely. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll call it off." "But Simon," he turned to the Duke, his expression deadly serious. "If you hurt her, I swear, I won't," Simon interrupted, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I swear to you, Anthony. I'll protect her with everything I have." The tension that had gripped the field slowly began to dissipate, the threat of violence ebbing away. The duel was over before it had even truly begun. Daphne let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her as the weight of the moment began to lift. She turned to Simon, her eyes searching his. "Don't run from this anymore. Don't run from us." Simon's heart ached as he looked at her, torn between the love he felt and the fear that still clung to him. But standing there, in the cold light of dawn, with Daphne's love laid bare before him, he knew he could no longer deny the truth. "I won't," he whispered, taking her hand in his. "I won't run anymore." The duel had not ended in gunfire, but it had still been a turning point, a moment of reckoning that would change everything. As Simon and Daphne stood together, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, they knew that their battle was far from over. But for the first time, they would face it together. The morning after the tumultuous duel, the sun rose brightly over London, its golden rays spilling into the Bridgerton home. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a mix of relief and lingering tension. Daphne sat at the breakfast table, her heart still racing from the events of the previous day. She absently stirred her tea, lost in thought as her family buzzed around her, the noise of clattering dishes and jovial chatter fading into the background. "Daphne, dear, are you quite all right?" her mother inquired, concern etched on her face as she placed a comforting hand on her daughter's arm. Daphne looked up, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Mama. Just thinking about that insufferable Duke." Anthony's voice cut through the air, his tone teasing but laced with protective undertones. "You know you're still welcome to reconsider any feelings you have for him, don't you?" Daphne felt her heart swell at her brother's care but shook her head. "It's not that simple, Anthony. It never has been." As the morning progressed, Daphne could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She needed to speak with Simon. The truth of her feelings lingered just below the surface, and she knew that confronting the complexities of their relationship was crucial. Hours later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting warm hues across the sky, Daphne found herself walking through the park, her mind swirling with thoughts of Simon. She had accepted that her heart was irrevocably tied to him, but she still felt the remnants of doubt. Could she truly trust him after everything he had shared about his past? Just as the first stars began to twinkle, she spotted Simon leaning against a grand oak tree, his silhouette framed by the evening light. He looked lost in thought, his features drawn tight with an intensity that made her heart race. "Daphne," he said softly, straightening as she approached. His expression shifted from contemplation to warmth, and for a moment, the world around them faded away. "Simon," she replied, feeling the weight of their previous conversation hanging between them. "I wanted to talk," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "About everything that happened yesterday." Daphne's heart pounded in her chest. "I know that it was an unorthodox way to handle things, but I'm grateful you both came to your senses." Simon stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "It's more than that. I want to talk about us, about what we mean to each other." "Us?" she echoed, a mix of hope and trepidation swirling within her. "I'm not here to ask you to marry me out of duty or obligation," he began, his voice low and sincere. "I'm asking because I love you, Daphne. I love you in a way that I never thought was possible. You've broken through my walls, and I want to build a future with you." Daphne felt her breath hitch, caught between joy and fear. "You can't just say that, Simon. You know the complexities of your past. What if it happens again? What if you push me away?" "I won't," he replied, stepping even closer, his eyes pleading with her. "I've spent so long running from love and from the idea of what I thought I wanted. But being with you has shown me that love is worth the risk. You are worth the risk." His words wrapped around her heart, filling the cracks with warmth. "But what if you change your mind?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if this is just a fleeting moment?" "It's not," he insisted, his voice firm. "I want to spend my life with you. I want to face the challenges together and create something beautiful, something that stands the test of time. Will you marry me, Daphne?" The weight of the question hung in the air, heavy with significance. Daphne felt her heart race, the rush of emotions swirling within her. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was determination and sincerity. "Simon," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "This is a monumental decision. You know my family, my life, they all expect so much from us. And your past, what if it comes back to haunt us? I can't change my past, but I can change my future," he replied, reaching for her hand. "With you, I can face anything. You give me strength I didn't know I needed. I want to be a better man for you." Tears brimmed in Daphne's eyes, the magnitude of his words washing over her like a tide. Could she really trust him? Could she believe that he would remain steadfast despite the shadows of his past? "Yes," she whispered, her heart full. "Yes, I will marry you." Simon's face broke into a radiant smile, relief flooding his features as he pulled her into an embrace. The warmth of his arms wrapped around her, filling her with a sense of safety and belonging. "You've made me the happiest man," he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the world around them faded away, leaving just the two of them in their bubble of joy. Daphne felt a sense of peace wash over her, the worries that had plagued her heart momentarily set aside, but deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. Together, They would face whatever challenges lay ahead, hand in hand, heart to heart. The complexities of their pasts would not be easily forgotten, but they would confront them together. In that moment, beneath the vast expanse of the evening sky, Daphne knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen love, and with it, a future full of promise and possibility. The grand hall of the Bridgerton estate was transformed into a vision of elegance and romance. White drapes cascaded from the ceiling, adorned with fragrant blooms of roses and lilies, filling the air with their sweet scent. Candlelight flickered softly, casting a warm glow that enveloped the entire room. It was a day to celebrate love, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Daphne stood in front of the ornate mirror, her heart racing as she adjusted the delicate lace veil that framed her face. The gown, a masterpiece of silk and satin, hugged her figure perfectly, its intricate embroidery reflecting the light as she moved. She couldn't help but admire how beautiful she felt, a feeling that had eluded her for so long. "Are you ready, my dear?" her mother asked gently, stepping into the room with a proud smile. Her own eyes sparkled with unshed tears. "I am," Daphne replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. "I can hardly believe this day has finally arrived." Her mother clasped her hands. "It's a moment to cherish, one that will be spoken of for years to come. You and Simon have captivated the ton in a way few ever manage." Daphne smiled, but a flicker of anxiety danced in her chest. Their courtship had not been without its challenges. The ton had scrutinized their every move, especially after the duel, and she was acutely aware that Lady Whistledown had taken a keen interest in their romance. The column she penned had the power to shape opinions, and Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that today's union would be fodder for her infamous gossip. As the clock chimed, announcing the hour, Daphne felt her pulse quicken. "It's time," her mother said softly, offering a reassuring smile. Daphne took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway, where her family awaited her. Anthony stood at the front, his expression one of protective pride. The rest of her siblings flanked him, each wearing matching smiles of encouragement. "Ready?" Anthony asked, straightening his jacket, and Daphne nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for the unwavering support of her family. Together, they made their way to the grand drawing room, where the ceremony would take place. Guests filled the seats, a sea of fine gowns and tailored coats, their eyes bright with curiosity and excitement. Among them were old friends, distant relatives, and the most elite members of society, all eagerly anticipating the event that would mark Daphne and Simon's union. As the music began, Daphne's breath hitched, and she gripped her father's arm tightly. The doors swung open, and the light poured in, illuminating the room as she stepped forward. The whispers ceased, and all eyes turned to her, a mix of admiration and astonishment evident in their gazes. Simon stood at the altar, his expression a mix of reverence and joy. Dressed in a tailored suit, he looked every bit the dashing Duke, his eyes locked onto Daphne as she approached. In that moment, all her doubts faded away, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. As she reached the altar, Simon took her hands in his grip warm and reassuring. The officiant began the ceremony, words echoing through the hall, blending with the soft rustle of fabric and the gentle shuffling of feet. Daphne could hardly focus on the words being spoken, all she could feel was the connection between her and Simon, a bond that felt both unbreakable and sacred. "Do you, Daphne Bridgerton, take Simon Basset to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the officiant asked, his voice echoing with significance. "I do," she replied, her voice steady and full of conviction. A collective sigh of approval rippled through the audience, and she couldn't help but glance at her family, their faces beaming with pride. "And do you, Simon Basset, take Daphne Bridgerton to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Simon said, his voice deep and resonant, laced with a sincerity that sent a thrill through Daphne. As they exchanged vows, a hush fell over the crowd, each person keenly aware of the momentous occasion. The words they spoke felt weighty, filled with promises and dreams for the future. When it came time to exchange rings, Daphne felt the cool metal slide onto her finger, and in that instant, she knew that she was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one that would be filled with challenges, joy, and a love that transcended all expectations. With the officiant's concluding words, the hall erupted into applause. Simon leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "You're incredible, Daphne." As they turned to face their guests, the cheers and congratulations washed over them like a wave. Daphne's heart soared, and she felt a sense of belonging that she had always longed for. But just as the excitement reached its peak, she felt a familiar flutter in her stomach. Lady Whistledown's column would undoubtedly be waiting to dissect every moment. Later, during the lavish reception, guests mingled beneath the twinkling chandeliers, laughter and conversation filling the air. Daphne and Simon navigated the crowd, graciously accepting well wishes from their friends and family. "I can hardly believe it," Daphne said, her voice full of wonder as they shared a moment together, sipping champagne and taking in the festivities. "We're married." "Indeed we are," Simon replied, his eyes sparkling with mirth. "And now we can begin our life together." As they exchanged smiles, Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that all eyes were upon them. The whispers of the ton had already begun, and she spotted a small group huddled in the corner, their gazes flicking to her and Simon with intrigue. "Look at them," one lady murmured, her tone dripping with envy. "A love match? It's quite extraordinary, really." "Extraordinary or scandalous," another chimed in, a knowing smirk on her lips. "Lady Whistledown will have a field day with this one." Daphne's heart sank slightly. She had anticipated the gossip, but hearing it spoken so openly made the reality hit harder. "What will she say?" she asked, her voice low, turning to Simon for reassurance. "Let her write what she will," Simon said, his voice strong and confident. "We have each other, and that is what matters most." But Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Whistledown's words would carry weight, altering her standing in society. She had once been the highly sought-after debutante. Now, she was the wife of a duke, a title that came with its own set of expectations. As the evening wore on, Lady Whistledown's column made its rounds, slipping into the hands of the curious and the judgmental alike. Whispers grew louder, tales of their whirlwind romance told and retold with exaggerated flair. But in that moment, surrounded by laughter and joy, Daphne chose to focus on the love she had found with Simon. The unexpected twists of their journey had led them to this moment, and no amount of gossip could diminish the bond they shared. As the evening drew to a close, Simon pulled her close, their fingers entwined. Ready to face the world together? He asked, his voice low and inviting. With you by my side, Daphne replied, her heart soaring. Always. Together, they stepped into the world, ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead, united in love, unwavering in their commitment, and prepared to navigate the complexities of society hand in hand. The morning sun streamed through the delicate lace curtains of the Bridgerton estate, casting a soft glow across the lavishly decorated bedroom. Daphne lay nestled beside Simon, their fingers intertwined beneath the covers, feeling a sense of peace she had longed for. Their wedding day had been a whirlwind of excitement, and as they settled into their new roles as husband and wife, a thrilling sense of anticipation filled the air. However, beneath the surface of their joy, lingering questions about the future hovered like storm clouds. Daphne knew that transitioning into married life would come with its own set of challenges, not least of which were the expectations of high society and the secrets that still shadowed Simon's past. As she turned to gaze at him, she couldn't help but smile at the sight of Simon still lost in slumber, his dark hair tousled and a faint smile playing on his lips. He looked peaceful, unguarded, and for a moment, all the complexities of their lives faded into the background. "Good morning, my love," she whispered, leaning in to place a soft kiss on his cheek. Simon stirred, his eyes fluttering open to meet hers. "Good morning," he replied, a lazy smile spreading across his face. "What a wonderful morning it is, indeed." Daphne laughed softly, her heart swelling at the warmth of his gaze. "I believe it is the first of many wonderful mornings we will share." As they dressed for the day, Daphne felt a sense of purpose. They had agreed to take on their new life together as a team, and she was determined to make their marriage thrive despite any obstacles that lay ahead. The Ton would be watching, and the gossip columns would continue to speculate, but she was resolved to carve out a place for them amidst the scrutiny. Once dressed, they descended the grand staircase, hand in hand, ready to face their family in the world. The Bridgerton home buzzed with activity as family members gathered for breakfast, laughter and chatter echoing through the halls. The vibrant atmosphere was a comforting reminder of the close-knit family Daphne cherished. "Look who has finally decided to grace us with their presence," Anthony called out, a teasing smile on his face as he spotted them entering the dining room. The other Bridgerton siblings joined in with playful banter, their faces lighting up at the sight of the newlyweds. "Did you two forget what time breakfast is served?" Benedict quipped, and Daphne felt the warmth of familial love envelop her. They settled into their seats, and as plates of food were passed around, Daphne felt the heaviness of the previous day's excitement begin to lift. Conversation flowed easily, filled with affectionate jests and light-hearted stories, but underneath the laughter, she sensed a subtle tension, particularly from Anthony. The eldest brother. His protective nature had always been a strong presence in her life, but now it was tinged with something more, a sense of responsibility for her well-being that felt heavier than ever. Daphne caught his eye across the table, and he offered a supportive nod, a silent promise that he would always be there for her. After breakfast, Simon suggested a stroll in the gardens. The morning was bright, and the fresh air was invigorating. Hand in hand, they walked amidst the blooms, the beauty of the flowers serving as a perfect backdrop for their budding life together. "Tell me, how do you truly feel about everything?" Simon asked, his voice steady as he glanced at her, a mixture of curiosity and concern evident in his eyes. About us, about being married? Daphne paused, her heart racing at the question. I feel hopeful, she admitted. But I also know that we have a long way to go. The world has its eyes on us, and there are still so many expectations to meet. Simon nodded thoughtfully. And I must admit, I am still coming to terms with the responsibilities that come with being a duke. Society's expectations can be stifling. The mention of his title brought a shadow over Simon's expression, and Daphne sensed the weight of his past still pressing upon him. We will navigate this together, Simon. We are a team now. He smiled, grateful for her reassurance. Yes, we are. But we must also confront the shadows of my past, the secrets that still linger. I do not want anything to come between us. Before Daphne could respond, a rustling sound drew their attention. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a familiar figure approaching, the charming and ever-elusive Lady Whistledown, her notepad in hand, seemingly ready to pen yet another column. Daphne, Simon. Lady Whistledown greeted, her voice bright with mischief. What a lovely morning it is. I couldn't help but notice you two wandering about, so blissfully united. One might even say it's the talk of the town. Daphne exchanged a knowing glance with Simon, the unspoken tension thickening the air. And what do you have to say about it, Lady Whistledown? Daphne asked, her curiosity piqued. Oh, merely that the world awaits to see how you shall navigate this new beginning. After all, dear Daphne, the true test of a marriage is not merely in the vows exchanged but in the challenges faced together. Daphne's heart raced, the implications of Lady Whistledown's words sinking in. What do you mean by that? Only that love is a beautiful thing, but it is often fraught with trials. Secrets can be as binding as vows, and sometimes, they can come to light when least expected. Lady Whistledown replied cryptically, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Simon tensed beside her, his expression guarded. We will face whatever challenges come our way, Lady Whistledown. Together, he asserted, determination lacing his words. Ah, a noble sentiment. Lady Whistledown exclaimed, her eyes sparkling. I do so love a tale of resilience. But remember, dear ones, the future is rarely as predictable as we wish it to be. With that, she waved a hand in farewell and strode away, her presence lingering like a shadow in the sunlight. Daphne watched her go, a mixture of concern and curiosity swirling within her. What did she mean by that? Daphne asked, turning to Simon, her voice low. I do not know, Simon admitted, his brow furrowing. But I intend to find out. Whatever secrets are still in the dark, I will confront them. You deserve nothing less than my full honesty. Daphne's heart swelled at his resolve. Then we will face it together, just as we have faced everything else, she said, squeezing his hand. As they continued their walk through the garden, the beauty of the day enveloped them, but in the back of her mind, Daphne couldn't shake the feeling that the challenges Lady Whistledown hinted at were closer than they thought. That in the days to come, they would learn the true meaning of partnership and love, weathering storms together, secrets emerging like tendrils of ivy seeking light. But for now, they walked in the warmth of the sun, ready to embrace their new beginning, bound by vows and a love that would guide them through whatever lay ahead. As they left the garden, Daphne caught a glimpse of the towering clouds on the horizon, shadows creeping in, but she held tightly to Simon's hand, determined to face the future, together.